The morning Eleanor Hale was supposed to disappear forever, her future husband showed up drunk at the station and grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks. "You're not going anywhere," Gerald Fitch slurred, his fingers digging into her skin while the platform crowd looked away. "Your daddy's debt is my debt now, and you're how I collect." Eleanor didn't scream. She'd learned not to scream. She just stood there on the platform at Redstone Station with her single battered suitcase, the locomotive breathing steam 20 feet away, and a man she'd met exactly twice, crushing the bones of her wrist like she was property he'd already paid for. She was 27 years old, and she had nowhere left on Earth to go. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and come along for the ride, because the story you're about to hear is one you won't want to walk away from halfway through. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, a like goes a long way. Now, let's get back to Eleanor. The Redstone Station platform was loud, the way frontier towns were always loud in the hour before a train pulled out. Boots on wooden planks, a porter hollering about baggage, two men arguing over a cart stacked with feed sacks. Nobody paid much attention to a woman in a gray wool coat getting her wrist squeezed by a thick-fingered man in a too-tight suit. That kind of thing didn't draw crowds. That kind of thing was just Tuesday. Eleanor Hale had not eaten since the previous afternoon. She'd spent the night on a cot in the back room of her father's old shop. Former shop, she corrected herself, because it didn't belong to the Hale family anymore. Nothing did. Her father, Bernard Hale, had died 6 weeks earlier with a smile on his face and approximately $4,000 in gambling debts attached to his name. Most of them owed to a man named Gerald Fitch, who ran a lending operation out of the back of a dry goods store and who did not extend credit out of the goodness of his heart. Gerald Fitch was 44 years old, recently widowed, and had decided that Eleanor would do very nicely as a replacement for the wife he'd buried in November. He had not asked her. He had informed her father's estate, what remained of it, that Eleanor would marry him within the month or the debts would be called in at interest that would leave her with nothing but the coat on her back and charges she couldn't answer. Eleanor had agreed because she hadn't seen another way out. She'd agreed, and then she'd spent 5 weeks trying to find one, and she hadn't. And so here she was on the platform at Redstone Station at 8:30 in the morning, with Gerald Fitch's hand around her wrist and the train she was supposed to board together with him, destination Callow Springs, where his house waited and his ring waited and her small particular future waited, steaming and ready 30 feet away. "You're hurting me," she said, quiet, factual. "You were walking the wrong direction." Gerald released her wrist but didn't step back. He smelled like whiskey and bay rum, and his eyes had that particular unfocused quality she'd come to recognize. Not falling down drunk, functional drunk. The kind that made men feel large. "Train boards in 12 minutes. You stay where I can see you." "I needed air." "You've got plenty of air. Stand here and get it." She stood. The mark of his fingers was already rising on her skin, a pale pink pressure bruise that would darken by noon. She pressed her hand against her coat and looked at the locomotive and tried to make herself feel something other than the flat gray nothing that had settled over her in the weeks since her father died. She couldn't quite manage it. The platform was thinning out as passengers moved toward the cars. A porter stacked luggage near the rear. Two women in traveling clothes said their goodbyes to an older gentleman who kept patting his breast pocket like he was reassuring himself his ticket was still there. A young boy chased a dog between adult legs until somebody grabbed him by the collar. Eleanor watched all of it with the practiced distance of someone who understood she was not part of any of it. She was cargo. She had been reduced, in the space of 6 weeks, from a woman with opinions and a small life she'd built carefully from limited materials into something a man owned the right to transport from one place to another. She thought about her father. Bernard Hale had been a funny man. Genuinely funny, not just jovial. He could make a room laugh without trying, could diffuse an argument with 3 words and a well-timed look. He'd been a terrible businessman and a mediocre father and an absolutely catastrophic gambler, and she had loved him anyway, with the complicated, exhausted love you develop for people who keep failing you in ways that aren't quite enough to make you stop. He'd held her hand at her mother's funeral when Eleanor was 9 years old, and he'd told her, "Whatever happens, Ellie, you're tougher than you look." She'd believed him for a long time. She was having trouble believing him this morning. "Train's boarding," Gerald said. He picked up her suitcase without asking. "Come on." Eleanor took one step toward the locomotive, then stopped. She didn't decide to stop. Her feet simply refused the next instruction. Gerald turned. "Eleanor?" She was looking at something past his left shoulder. A man had appeared at the far end of the platform. Appeared wasn't quite right. He'd been there a moment, but something about the way he moved made him suddenly visible in the way that a storm front becomes visible on a clear day. Not all at once, but with a gathering certainty you can't look away from. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a rancher's coat that had seen significant weather. He was scanning the platform with the focused expression of someone looking for a very specific thing and running out of time to find it. His eyes landed on Eleanor and he stopped walking. "Eleanor," Gerald said again, harder. The man crossed the platform in about 8 strides. Up close, he was older than she'd initially read. Early 30s, maybe, with the kind of face that outdoor work ages honestly, lines at the corners of his eyes that weren't from smiling. He was not smiling now. He looked like a man who had driven a long way through difficult conditions on insufficient sleep to get to this platform before that train left. And he had barely made it, and he knew it. He looked at her wrist. At the mark Gerald had left, something moved behind his eyes. "Ma'am," he said. "Forgive me, I don't have time to explain this properly." He cut a glance at Gerald, something measuring and cool in it, before coming back to Eleanor. "My name is Colton Mercer. I run the Mercer Ranch, about 14 miles northeast of here. My wife passed 8 months ago, and I have 2 boys who are 4 years old, and I cannot—" He stopped, pressed his jaw together, started again. "I need someone to help care for them. I need someone who can be at the ranch within the week. I was told, someone in town said you might be in a situation where—" "Who told you that?" Eleanor asked. "Martha Greer at the dress shop. She said you were—" He glanced at Gerald again. The measuring look held longer this time. "She said you might be looking for a different arrangement." Gerald laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "She's not looking for anything. We're boarding a train in about 6 minutes, friend, so whatever you're selling—" "I'm not talking to you," Colton said. The words were not loud. They were not aggressive in any theatrical sense. They landed with the particular weight of a man who had spent years giving instructions on a working ranch and had learned that volume was rarely necessary when clarity would do. Gerald's mouth closed. Colton kept his eyes on Eleanor. 6 months, he said. Housekeeper and caretaker, separate quarters, proper arrangement, wages paid monthly. At the end of 6 months, if you want to leave, I'll see you get wherever you're going safely. He paused. The boys, Owen and Eli, they're not doing well. I've tried everything I know how to try, and I don't know what else to do. He said that last part like it cost him something to say it. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the train. She looked at Gerald Fitch, who was holding her suitcase and whose face had gone a particular shade of red that she recognized as the prelude to a scene. 12 weeks ago, she would have said she was not a gambling woman. She would have said she was cautious and practical, and not given to leaping into arrangements with strangers on train platforms. She would have said a lot of things about herself that the last 6 weeks had quietly made untrue. How old did you say your boys are? She said. 4. They turned 4 in September. And you said they're not doing well. What does that mean exactly? Something shifted in his face. The controlled expression cracked just slightly at one edge. They don't speak much. They used to laugh. My wife, He stopped again. They haven't laughed in 8 months. Either of them. The train whistle blew. 1 minute. Gerald grabbed Eleanor's arm. Not her wrist this time. Her arm above the elbow, grip hard and unambiguous. We are boarding. Let go of her. Colton's voice was still level. Something underneath it was not. This is none of your business, Mercer. I said let go of her arm. Gerald's grip tightened. Eleanor felt it. The decision point. The place where things either escalated into something public and messy or collapsed back into the pattern of Gerald getting what Gerald wanted because Eleanor couldn't see a way to stop him. She made a decision. She reached down and took her suitcase out of Gerald's other hand. He was so focused on Colton that he didn't react fast enough to stop her. She stepped back, putting 3 feet of platform between herself and Gerald, and she looked at Colton Mercer and said, "All right." Gerald's face went from red to something beyond red. "All right? All right? You owe me, Eleanor. Your father's debt." "My father's debt was to you," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I don't have a signature on anything. You can speak to whatever lawyer you'd like to speak to about a dead man's obligations." She had no idea if this was legally accurate. She was hoping Gerald didn't know either. From the look on his face, he wasn't certain. "You will regret this," Gerald said. The drunk large feeling had drained out of him, and what was underneath it was smaller and meaner. "You think you can just—" "You'll come crawling back, Eleanor. You'll have nowhere else to go, and you'll come back to me, and I won't be as generous the second time." "I'll take my chances," Eleanor said. She turned away from him. She wasn't sure her legs would hold, but they did. She walked to the edge of the platform, away from the boarding cars, away from the train that had been the only future she could see 20 minutes ago, and she stood there with her suitcase while the locomotive began to move, and Gerald Fitch's voice followed her down the platform. "You'll regret this. Nobody wants you. You're a debt on 2 legs." Until the noise of the departing train swallowed it. Colton Mercer appeared at her side. He said nothing for a moment. They both watched the train go. "I should tell you," he said finally, "I don't have a plan beyond getting you to the ranch. I haven't done this before. Asked a stranger for help like this." "Neither have I," Eleanor said. "Agreed to go with one." "Fair." He picked up her suitcase before she could object. "My wagon's at the livery. It's about a 40-minute drive." "I should know," Eleanor said. "I don't have much in that case. I left in a hurry about 6 weeks ago, and I haven't been able to replace much. We can get what you need in town before we head out." "I can't. I'm short on funds." "I'll cover it." He said it the way practical men said practical things, without making it feel like charity or making her feel like she should object. "It's part of wages. We'll sort out what you owe later if you want, or we won't. Doesn't matter to me." Eleanor looked at him sideways. She'd been told things by men before. Reasonable things, fair things, and learned later what the conditions were. "What do you actually want from this arrangement, Mr. Mercer? Honestly." He stopped walking, turned to look at her, and she read in his face the kind of fatigue that didn't come from one bad night, but from 8 months of them stacked on top of each other. "I want my boys to laugh again," he said. "That's the whole of it." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why. She'd been wrong about people before. Badly wrong, and she wasn't in a position to be wrong again. But something in the stripped-down simplicity of it, the way he said that's the whole of it without flourish or persuasion, landed true. "All right, Mr. Mercer," she said, "lead the way." The Mercer wagon was a working vehicle, solid and practical, not the kind of conveyance that announced its owner's wealth, though Eleanor was beginning to register that Colton Mercer's wealth was the kind that didn't need announcing. The horses were excellent. The tack was well maintained. A man who kept his horses that way took the maintenance of things seriously. She didn't learn much more about him on the drive to the ranch. He wasn't an easy talker, and Eleanor was too tired and too bewildered by her own choices to push conversation. She watched the landscape instead, the way the low winter grass ran flat to the horizon, the particular gray-blue of the sky before noon, the distant line of hills that meant they were moving northeast the way he'd said. "Tell me about your boys," she said, about 20 minutes in. He kept his eyes on the road. His hands on the reins were easy, unhurried. "Owen talks more than Eli. Or he did. He's the one who asks questions, used to drive Margaret." He stopped. "Used to drive their mother half to crazy with the questions. Why is the sky that color? Why do horses need shoes? Why can't we eat pie for breakfast?" That kind of thing. "And now?" He still asks questions, fewer, quieter, like he's not sure he deserves an answer anymore. He paused. "Eli doesn't say much at all. He just started really talking before Margaret died. He had maybe 50 words and he was adding new ones every day, and then..." Another pause. "He's had maybe 50 words total in the last 8 months. Eleanor absorbed this. Nightmares? Both of them. Most nights. Sometimes Owen wakes up screaming and Eli sleeps through it. Sometimes it's the other way. Some nights both of them, one after the other. He glanced at her briefly. I'm not telling you this to frighten you off. I want you to know what you're walking into. I appreciate that. The housekeeper before this arrangement, she lasted 3 weeks, said the crying was more than she could manage. The one before her didn't make it 2 weeks. He said it without bitterness, just as information. I'm not easy to work for. I've been told I'm not easy to be around this past year. I forget to eat. I forget other people need things. I get into something on the ranch and I disappear for hours, and I don't think about whether anyone's wondering where I am. I'll manage, Eleanor said. You don't have to say that to be polite. I'm not being polite. I've been managing men who forget to think about other people's needs for most of my life. She said it plainly, without bitterness either. It was just true. It's familiar territory. He was quiet for a moment, then, Your father? Partly. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. She marked that as a point in his favor. The ranch appeared in stages, first the fence line, then the outbuildings, then the main house, which was larger than she'd expected and more imposing, a 2-story structure that would have been handsome if it hadn't looked so exhausted. That was the word that came to her. Exhausted. Not run down. It was maintained, clearly. The fences were sound and the yard was kept. But there was no life to the surface of it. No light in the downstairs windows. No sign of movement. She thought of what he'd said. They used to laugh. Colton stopped the wagon at the front of the house, and a man appeared from the direction of the barn, 40s, weathered, with the bow-legged walk of someone who'd spent decades on horseback. He looked at Eleanor without any particular expression. This is Walt Grady, Colton said. He's been foreman here since before I inherited the place. Walt, this is Miss Eleanor Hale. She'll be staying on to help with the boys. Walt's expression didn't exactly warm, but something in it reorganized. Miss Hale? He touched the brim of his hat. Mr. Grady. Boys are inside, Walt said to Colton. Rosa fed them lunch. They ate about half of it. Colton nodded. He climbed down from the wagon and came around to take Eleanor's suitcase, and she didn't argue this time because her arms were tired. He pushed the front door open and held it for her, and she stepped inside. The house was warmer than the outside air and smelled of wood smoke and something cooked. Bread, maybe, or biscuits, faint and pleasant underneath the cold smell of a house that was heated but not quite inhabited. She stood in the front hallway and let her eyes adjust to the indoor light. 2 small boys sat at the bottom of the staircase. They were identical in the way that made you look twice and still not be sure. Same dark hair, same wide eyes, same particular stillness. They were wearing matching heavy sweaters, and they were looking at her with the careful, untrusting attention of children who had learned to assess new adults before committing to any response. Eleanor crouched down. Not immediately. She waited a beat, gave them a moment to see her do it, so it wasn't sudden. Hello, she said. I'm Eleanor. The boy on the left, she'd learn later this was Owen, looked at his brother, then back at her. Are you staying? He asked. His voice was small and slightly rough, like it didn't get used much. For a while, Eleanor said. Yes. Clara left, the other boy, Eli, said. Just that. 3 syllables delivered flat. I heard. I'm sorry she did. Eleanor meant it. That must have been hard. Eli looked at her for a long moment with his father's eyes and his mother's absence behind them. Then he looked down at his hands. Owen said, Do you know how to make biscuits? I do, Eleanor said. Clara burned them, Owen said. I'm better at them than Clara was. She had no idea if this was true. She'd find out. I'm better at most things than I look. Owen considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old evaluating a very important claim. How old are you? Owen, Colton said from behind Eleanor. It's fine, Eleanor said without turning around. 27, she told Owen. That's old, Owen said. It really is, Eleanor agreed. I've had a lot of time to practice biscuits. Something moved in Owen's face. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of what a smile felt like.
surfacing briefly before going back under. But it was something. Eleanor stood up. Her knees ached from the crouch. The cold got into them, and she straightened slowly. The boys watched her. "I'd like to see the kitchen," she said to Colton, "and wherever I'll be sleeping, if that's all right, and then maybe the boys can show me where things are kept. Boys usually know where things are better than anyone." Colton nodded. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something careful in it, something that had needed reassurance it hadn't found in a long time and wasn't sure what to do with the possibility of finding it. "Rosa will show you around," he said. "She helps in the afternoons. She knows where everything is." Rosa turned out to be a compact woman in her 50s with quick hands and very little patience for anything unnecessary. She walked Eleanor through the kitchen, the pantry, the laundry room, and the small bedroom off the back hallway that would be Eleanor's, delivering information in clipped, efficient sentences and occasionally glancing at Eleanor as if she was running some kind of private assessment. "You'll last longer if you don't try to mother him," Rosa said, without preamble, as she was showing Eleanor the linen closet. "I beg your pardon?" "Mr. Mercer, women come here and they see a man in grief and a big house, and they start—" Rosa made a gesture that compressed a complicated phenomenon into something dismissible. "He doesn't want a mother. He wants his children taken care of." "That's what I'm here for," Eleanor said. Rosa looked at her for a long moment. "Good," she said finally, and moved on to showing her where the good towels were kept. Eleanor's room was small and clean and cold. Cold because no fire had been laid in the small fireplace, which told her it had been some time since the room had been used. She set her suitcase on the bed and sat beside it and looked at the window, which faced the side yard and a stand of bare trees beyond. She had $8.40 in her coat pocket. She had the clothes in her suitcase and the coat she was wearing. She had left behind a life that hadn't amounted to much, but had at least been familiar, and she had walked toward something she understood almost nothing about on the strength of a stranger's honest face and two small boys sitting at the bottom of a staircase. She was either very brave or very foolish, and she suspected the difference between those two things was mostly a matter of how things turned out. She unpacked her suitcase because there was nothing else to do. 3 dresses, 2 of them practical and 1 not quite, a nightgown, a hairbrush her mother had given her, a book she'd read twice already but kept anyway. She arranged these things in the small dresser and hung the not-quite-practical dress in the narrow wardrobe and told herself she would do her job well and keep her head down and take each day as it came. Then she went back to the kitchen to see about biscuits because she'd made a claim and she intended to back it up. She found Owen standing in the kitchen doorway. "Are you actually making them?" he said. "If you show me where the flour is." He crossed to the pantry with the particular purposeful walk of a child doing important work and pointed at the flour bin like it was treasure he'd personally discovered. "There." "Good. What about butter?" "Cold room." He pointed again. "Out the back." "Will you get it for me? The cold room might be too cold for me." This was not true, but she said it anyway, and he accepted it with complete seriousness and disappeared out the back door. She heard his footsteps on the wooden boards outside and then the scrape of the cold room door. She started measuring flour. Heard something in the doorway and looked over. Eli was there. Not Owen. Eli. He hadn't followed her before, had stayed at the bottom of the stairs looking at his hands. He was looking at her now. "You can come in," she said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table without being asked, pulled his knees up to his chest, and watched her with the focused attention of someone watching something they didn't entirely trust but couldn't quite look away from. Owen came back with the butter. "Got it. Perfect. Can you both keep track of how many pinches of salt I put in? I sometimes lose count." This was obviously fabricated, but both boys accepted it immediately, the way children accept assignments that give them a task and a reason to be present. Owen nodded very seriously. Eli held up his fingers, apparently ready to count. Eleanor began making biscuits. The kitchen got warmer. Outside the window, the light was starting to thin toward afternoon. She didn't think about Gerald Fitch. She didn't think about the train she hadn't boarded, or the life she'd left unfinished, or the $8.40 in her coat, or the 6 months of arrangement she'd agreed to on a platform with a stranger. She thought about the right ratio of butter to flour and the correct thickness to roll the dough, and whether these two small boys had eaten anything today that had been made with any particular care. Colton came into the kitchen a while later and stopped in the doorway. His sons were both at the kitchen table. Owen was talking, not quietly, but at something approaching full 4-year-old volume, about a horse named Bucket and what Bucket had done last Tuesday that had required 3 ranch hands to intervene. Eli was listening, and Eli's face had relaxed out of the tight, careful blankness she'd seen at the foot of the stairs into something younger, something that looked the age he actually was. Eleanor didn't turn around. She was pulling biscuits from the oven. She heard Colton not say anything. She heard the quality of his silence change. She said without turning, "Supper will be ready in about an hour. There's leftover soup from lunch if anyone's hungry before then." "Thank you," Colton said. His voice was strange. She glanced back and he was still standing in the doorway looking at his sons, and his face was doing something she hadn't expected to see on the face of a man she'd met 4 hours ago. Something that was trying very hard not to become the kind of thing a man of his particular type would not allow himself in a kitchen doorway in front of his children and a woman he'd just hired. Eleanor turned back to her biscuits and gave him a moment to collect himself. "Owen," she said, "go tell your father what you told me about Bucket." Owen swiveled toward the doorway with the targeted energy of a child who had been waiting for exactly this opening. He launched into the story of Bucket's Tuesday adventure at full speed, gesturing widely, and Colton came the rest of the way into the kitchen and crouched down to hear it at his son's level, and Eleanor kept her eyes on the stove and her hands on the work. She would make no promises. She would take no risks with her heart that she wasn't prepared to afford. She would do the job she had agreed to do, and she would do it well, and that was all she had decided. But in the kitchen at Mercer Ranch, with 2 small boys starting tentatively to come back to life, Eleanor Hale thought that maybe she had not been wrong to step away from that train. She hadn't been right about much lately. She was not sure she was right about this. But she was still here. And the biscuits came out fine. Not perfect. They were a little uneven, and the bottoms caught just slightly on one side. But fine. She could work with fine. The biscuits were gone by morning. Eleanor found the empty pan on the kitchen table when she came down at 5:30, still pulling her hair back, still not quite awake. One biscuit had been torn in half and the halves separated, the way children divide things when they can't agree on who gets the bigger piece. She stood there looking at it for a moment, then put water on for coffee and got to work. That was the first week. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a turning point. It was just work. The specific, relentless work of a house that had been operating without a center for 8 months. Everything functional, but nothing quite right. Like a watch that keeps time, but runs a few minutes slow every day until you stop trusting it entirely. She learned the rhythms of the ranch by paying attention. Colton was up before dawn, out to the barn before the sun cleared the hills, back briefly at noon and then gone again until the light died. He ate what was put in front of him without complaint and without much comment, and he thanked her for meals in the distracted way of a man who remembered he was supposed to, and not quite as an instinct. He was not unkind. He was not present. Walt Grady came through the kitchen most mornings for coffee, and he was the one who told her things, where the root cellar was, which horse was dangerous in the left stall, that the well pump needed a particular kind of coaxing in cold weather. He offered information the way he offered everything, without ceremony, without warmth, as plain, useful fact. Eleanor took it that way, and he seemed to appreciate that. Rosa came afternoons and managed the laundry and the deep cleaning with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped requiring any input on the subject. She and Eleanor developed a working arrangement that was not a friendship but functioned like one. Parallel orbits that occasionally intersected, information passed back and forth without sentiment. The boys were the center of everything Eleanor did, and the hardest thing, and the most important. Owen asked her questions constantly. This did not stop. Colton had not been exaggerating about the questions. He asked why the frost formed on the inside of windows and not the outside. He asked why horses slept standing up, and whether it hurt. He asked her once, with the tone of someone who had been thinking about this for some time, "Did your mother die too?" Eleanor was rolling pie dough. She kept rolling. "Yes," she said.
A long time ago. I was 9. Owen thought about this. Did it get better? It got different, Eleanor said. You learn to carry it differently. Like a heavy thing you get stronger holding. Owen considered this with the serious face he brought to all serious things. Eli doesn't carry things, he said. He just puts them down and doesn't pick them up. Eleanor set down her rolling pin and looked at him. What do you mean? Like Mama's blanket, Owen said. He used to sleep with it. After she died, he put it in the closet, and he just stopped. He does that with stuff. He picked at a loose thread on his sweater. He puts things down and acts like they were never his. Eleanor picked up her rolling pin. Thank you for telling me that, she said. She meant it carefully. Owen looked relieved, like he'd been carrying the observation for a while without anyone to hand it to. Eli was harder to read and harder to reach. He was not hostile. He was watchful, the way a small animal is watchful, comfortable enough to be in the room but positioned always near a door. He ate Eleanor's food. He accepted her presence with a kind of minimal tolerance that was not rejection but wasn't yet trust. He watched Owen interact with her with the focused attention of someone evaluating whether a thing was safe before attempting it themselves. The nightmares were real. She'd been warned, and she was still not prepared for them. The first time it happened was her third night at the ranch. Owen's voice, high and panicked, breaking through her sleep around 2 in the morning. She was up and down the hall before she was fully conscious, because her body apparently had a system for this, even if her mind had been asleep, and she found Owen sitting upright in his bed with his hands pressed to his face and the absolute specific quality of terror that belongs only to children and the recently bereaved. She sat on the edge of his bed. Hey, she said. Owen, I'm here. You're in your room. He pulled his hands from his face and looked at her with eyes that were still half in the dream. She was there, he said. Mama was there, and then she wasn't. I know, Eleanor said. She didn't know. She couldn't know. But it was the right word for that moment. That kind of dream hurts. It's the same one, Owen said. It's always the same one. She stayed until his breathing slowed. She rubbed his back in small circles the way she had seen mothers do, and she talked to him in a low, even voice about nothing important, what the ranch would look like in spring, whether she thought Bucket was smarter than the average horse, what kind of pie she might make tomorrow, until his eyes got heavy. He was asleep again in 15 minutes. She was standing in the hallway when she registered Colton's door was open. He was standing in the frame of it. She had no idea how long he'd been there. I usually go to him, Colton said. He said it without accusation, just fact, and underneath the fact something that might have been guilt about the fact. You can still go, Eleanor said. I didn't mean to overstep. You didn't. He was quiet for a moment. He was wearing a shirt that hadn't been tucked in, and his feet were bare, and he looked more tired than she'd yet seen him, which was saying something. He went back to sleep? Yes, Colton nodded. He looked at Owen's door for a moment, then, when I go to him, he goes back to sleep, but it takes longer. He stopped. I don't know what to say to him. You don't have to say much, Eleanor said. Mostly they just need to know someone's there. I know that, he said, and from the way he said it, she understood he knew it and did it, and that it didn't work as well as it should, and that this was one of the things that was eating him from the inside. The competent man, the rancher, who knew what everything required and how to provide it, who could not provide the one thing his sons needed most. She didn't tell him it would be fine. She didn't offer reassurance she wasn't qualified to give. Get some sleep, she said instead. You look terrible. Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or the faint edge of something closer to a laugh. Thank you, he said dry. I mean it constructively. I'm sure you do, he said, and went back into his room and closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back to her own room and lay down and stared at the ceiling until sleep found her again, which took longer than it should have. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. The ranch began to feel less like foreign territory and more like a place she understood, which was not the same thing as comfort, but was a necessary precondition for it. She learned which floorboards creaked and how to avoid them at night. She learned that Owen would eat almost anything, but had a particular and specific hatred of cooked carrots that was not negotiable. She learned that Eli, given paper and a pencil, would draw for hours. Animals, mostly. Horses and dogs, and once a detailed rendering of a bird that was technically not bad for a 4-year-old and made Rosa stop and look at it twice. She pinned that drawing to the kitchen wall without asking anyone. Nobody said anything about it, but she caught Eli looking at it the next morning with the specific expression of someone who had made something and found it still there. She started leaving paper and pencils on the kitchen table. She did not push Eli to talk. She included him in everything. Asked his opinion, described things she was doing, made space and conversation for him to enter if he chose. But she didn't crowd the space. She talked to Owen and let Eli listen. She asked Owen questions and occasionally rephrased the answer to Eli in a way that invited him in. Owen says you're the better rider. Is that true? He'd looked at his hands and then nodded, once, with a seriousness that suggested he was being factual rather than modest. Maybe you can show me sometime, Eleanor said. He'd looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd looked at Owen. Owen had shrugged with the magnificent indifference of a 4-year-old who had already processed this information and moved on. Eli looked back at Eleanor. Okay, he said. One word. But it was a whole word, unprompted, directed at her, and Eleanor had kept her face very carefully neutral and said good and gone back to what she was doing. Rosa, who had been at the stove and had heard all of it, caught Eleanor's eye across the kitchen and gave her a single small nod. Eleanor accepted it without comment. It was right around the end of the 4th week that the trouble from town announced itself. It came first through Walt, who was not a man who delivered information gently. He came into the kitchen one morning when Colton was out on the eastern fence line and Rosa hadn't arrived yet, and he accepted the coffee Eleanor poured him, and he said, "People are talking." Eleanor set down the coffee pot. About? About you. About the arrangement. Walt wrapped both hands around his mug. It's a small town, Miss Hale. Woman shows up, moves into a rich man's house. No one knows her from anywhere. People think I'm after his money, Eleanor said. Walt looked at her without expression. Some do. And what do you think? He considered this with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who didn't spend words carelessly. I think you made biscuits your second day here, and Eli ate 3 of them, he said. That's more than Clara managed in 3 weeks. It wasn't an answer to her question, but it was something. She took it that way. She had heard some of it herself on the one trip she'd made into town the previous week to replace a broken pot. The woman at the dry goods counter had been civil in the precise way that meant she was working at it. 2 women near the post office had looked at her and then looked away, and one had said something to the other in a voice low enough to deny but loud enough to land. Eleanor had kept her spine straight and her face neutral and bought what she'd come to buy and driven the wagon home. And she'd sat in the barn for a few minutes before going inside because she needed somewhere to be angry that was not in front of the boys. She was not unused to being talked about. She had grown up as Bernard Hale's daughter, which meant she'd grown up in the particular social position of someone people felt sorry for and looked down on simultaneously. She knew how to manage it. What she hadn't anticipated was how much harder it was to manage when it was being used against an arrangement that was not, whatever people assumed, what they assumed it was. She and Colton had not had that conversation. They had not had most conversations, actually. They operated through the ranch in parallel, information shared when necessary, silence the default. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people with a lot to manage who had agreed without speaking on their priorities. But the talk in town was going to become something that required speaking about, and she knew it, and she suspected he did too. She found out just how complicated it was on a Thursday evening when Colton came in from the ranch later than usual, ate dinner in the kitchen while the boys were already in bed, and sat at the table after Rosa had gone with his coffee going cold in front of him. Eleanor was washing up. She had learned not to interpret his silences because most of them were just weather, not directed at anything, just the condition he moved through. But this one had a different quality, and after 10 minutes she dried her hands and sat down across from him. Something happened, she said. He looked up. He'd been somewhere else, and it took him a moment to come back. I ran into Harlan Voss today. She didn't know the name. She said so. Margaret's father. He said it flat. He was in town. He came out to the fence line to find me, which means he asked around to know where I was. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. What did he want? To see the boys. Colton wrapped both hands around his coffee mug in the exact mirror of Walt's gesture that morning, and Eleanor thought, this is what men do with their hands when they don't know what else to do with them. I told him they were at the ranch and he could visit. And? He said visiting wasn't what he was thinking about. Colton's jaw worked for a moment. He said Margaret's mother hasn't recovered from losing her, and that what might help her recover was having the boys closer, in the city. He looked at Eleanor with the eyes of a man who had been running numbers on something and didn't like what they added up to. He said it in that tone, the way Harlan says things that sound like suggestions but aren't. Eleanor absorbed this carefully. Do they have standing to do that? Legally? They have money, Colton said, and connections, and a daughter in the ground whose death I made possible by insisting she stay at the ranch when she should have gone to the doctor in October. He said it the way he'd apparently been saying it to himself for 8 months. Flat, factual, a charge he'd long since stopped defending himself against. They think I failed her. Maybe they're right. And if they want to argue that in front of a judge, they've got the resources to make it complicated. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. What do they actually want? I don't know yet, but Harlan doesn't make social visits. He pushed his coffee mug slightly away. The ranch sits on a route that the Central Valley Railroad has been surveying for 2 years. Whoever controls this land controls that route. I've had 3 offers to sell and turned them all down. He looked at her. Margaret's parents never cared much about the boys when Margaret was alive. They sent gifts and visited once a year. And now they care. Now they care, Colton said. They sat with that for a moment. You should know something, Eleanor said. I went into town last week. There's talk about me being here. I know. It might complicate things if this becomes a legal situation. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. Does it change anything for you? What people are saying? She thought about Gerald Fitch on the train platform, about being cargo, about the mark on her wrist that had taken 10 days to fully fade. People have been saying things about me most of my life, she said. I'm still here. Something in his face shifted slightly. Not softened. That wasn't the right word for him. More like something that had been braced against impact readjusted itself. I should have told you sooner, he said, about the Voss family. Yes, Eleanor said. You should have. He accepted this without argument. She marked that too. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the small room off the back hallway and listened to the ranch settle around her and thought about railroad routes and family courts and how much damage a family with enough money and a sympathetic story could do if they decided they wanted to. She thought about Owen asking if it got better. She thought about Eli saying okay in the kitchen with the weight of a major concession. She thought about what it would mean for both of them if someone decided to take them away. She was still awake when she heard Eli. It wasn't screaming. That was Owen's pattern. Eli's nightmares came out differently. A low sound, almost a whimper, that escalated in irregular steps, like a fire catching. She was down the hall in half a minute. Eli was sitting up in bed. His eyes were open but not tracking. The particular not quite awake look of a child caught between the dream and the room. He was saying something too low and too broken to make out, his hands pressed flat to the mattress on either side of him like he was checking it was still there. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. Eli, she said, quiet even. You're in your room. I'm here. He didn't respond for a moment. Then his eyes found her face and stayed there. She wasn't there, he said. The words came out rough and halting, like they were being pulled from somewhere deep. I looked, and she wasn't. I know, Eleanor said. Same word she'd used with Owen. Same impossible, inadequate word. She's not coming back, Eli said. Not a question. 4 years old and already past questions into the flat, hard country of fact. Eleanor could have argued with this, could have found some soft way to redirect it,
some children's story version of death and loss and the things we carry. She didn't. No, she said. She's not.
Eli looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated and terrible, the specific contortion of a child trying to hold something too large for the size of him. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to Eleanor's shoulder. She put her arm around him and held on. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. He cried for about 3 minutes, hard, ugly, whole-body crying that she suspected he hadn't done in a while, maybe since the early days, maybe never quite like this. She held him through it and rubbed his back and kept her face against the top of his head and waited. When it stopped the way those things stop. Gradually, then suddenly, the gasping settling into hiccups and then into quiet breathing. "Okay," he said finally, which was the word he used, she was learning, when he needed to signal that something was finished and he was ready to move forward. "Okay," Eleanor agreed. She stayed until he was asleep again. He fell asleep with his hand in hers, which she hadn't expected, and which made her throat do something she refused to give in to. When she stood up to go, she found Owen awake in the other bed, watching her. "He does that sometimes," Owen said quietly. "Cries like that. He hasn't for a while." "I know. Is it bad that he did it now?" "No," Eleanor said. "It means he felt safe enough too." Owen thought about this. "Did we make you feel safe?" he asked. "When you first got here?" The question surprised her into honesty. "You made me feel needed," she said. "That's close enough for a start." Owen nodded with the slow gravity of someone filing this away. "Okay," he said. He used Eli's word and she understood it was shared between them for exactly this purpose. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes and took 3 slow breaths. She had told herself she would not get attached. She had told herself this was a job, a 6-month arrangement, a practical solution to a specific problem. She had told herself a lot of things on a train platform at 8:30 in the morning when she was running on no sleep and $8.40. She was attached. There was no point pretending otherwise. The question, the one she couldn't answer yet, the one that waited for her every morning when she came down to start the coffee, was whether the thing she was building here was something that would hold, or whether it was the kind of thing that got taken away just when you'd finished building it. She had some experience with the second kind. She thought about Harlan Voss and the railroad route crossing Mercer Ranch, and 2 small boys in a courtroom in some distant city being asked which parent they wanted to live with, and she pressed her hands harder against her eyes until the thought retreated. One day at a time. That was all she had the materials for. She came down in the morning and made breakfast. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hair sticking up on one side and asked her if she could make the eggs the round way or the flat way. And she said, "What's the round way?" And he explained it with hand gestures that were not quite sufficient. And she said, "Make it with your hands again slower." And he did. And she made eggs the way he described. And they were not quite right, but close enough that he declared them successful with the authority of a boy who had made a decision and was sticking with it. Eli came down quietly and sat at the table. He looked at Eleanor when she set his plate in front of him. Not a long look, just a moment, just long enough. Then he picked up his fork and started eating. Outside, the wind came off the hills with an edge to it that meant the real cold was coming. Inside, the kitchen smelled of eggs and coffee and wood smoke and the particular living smell of a house that was occupied by people who were, slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantees, starting to need each other. Eleanor poured herself coffee and stood at the window for a moment and watched the frost on the glass begin to melt as the room warmed up. She'd told Owen it got different, that you learned to carry things differently. She was learning. The frost that had been melting off the kitchen window each morning started staying longer into the day, and then it stopped melting at all. Winter came to Mercer Ranch the way serious things come, gradually and then all at once, with a finality that made you understand you hadn't been taking the warning seriously enough. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night in the second week of November, and Eleanor woke to find ice on the inside of her bedroom window and both boys in the hallway outside her door, Owen hopping from foot to foot and Eli standing very still with his arms wrapped around himself. "The fire went out," Owen announced. "I can see that," Eleanor said. "Come on." She got them downstairs and started the kitchen stove and made oatmeal while they sat huddled at the table in their coats, and the house slowly remembered how to be warm. Colton came in from the barn an hour later with ice in his hair and the specific tight-jawed look of a man who had found something broken that he needed to fix before it cost him, and he poured coffee and drank it standing up and said they'd need to check the water lines before noon or they'd be hauling from the well for the rest of the week. "Owen's boots have worn through on the left one," Eleanor said. "I noticed it yesterday. He'll need new ones before the snow comes." Colton looked at Owen's feet under the table. Owen, aware suddenly that his feet were the subject of an adult conversation, pulled them back under his chair. "I'll take him into town Saturday," Colton said. "I can take him," Eleanor said, "if you need to stay with the lines." He looked at her across the kitchen with the considering look she'd gotten used to, the one that meant he was recalibrating something. "All right," he said. "Take Eli too. He needs a coat that fits." This was how they operated, she and Colton. In the logistics of children and ranch maintenance, in the practical language of what needed doing and who could do it. It was not the same as knowing each other, but it was something, a working trust built from weeks of small, reliable acts, and Eleanor had learned to value it for what it was, rather than measuring it against what it wasn't. She took the boys to town on Saturday. It did not go the way she'd planned. The boot shop was straightforward. Owen selected his new boots with the gravity of a man making a significant purchase and wore them immediately out of the store, leaving his old ones behind without a backward glance. Eli's coat took longer because Eli had opinions about the buttons, and the first two coats had the wrong ones, and Eleanor negotiated with him in the quiet, serious way that worked with Eli until they found a coat he'd accept. They were coming out of the dry goods store when she saw Gerald Fitch. He was across the street, and for a moment she wasn't sure it was him. The same thick neck and too tight suit, but she'd half believed the distance between Redstone Station and Mercer Ranch was enough to make him a different problem belonging to a different life. It wasn't. He was talking to another man she didn't recognize, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him. His expression did something unpleasant. He said something to the other man without looking away from Eleanor. Owen said, "Who's that?" "Nobody important," Eleanor said. "Hold my hand, please." She kept her pace even and didn't look back, but she felt Gerald's eyes on her all the way down the block, and she understood from the quality of his conversation with the unknown man that whatever she'd hoped would be behind her was not, in fact, entirely behind her. She told Colton that night, after the boys were in bed. She sat across from him at the kitchen table in the same configuration as the conversation about Harlan Voss, which was apparently where serious information got exchanged in this house, and she described what she'd seen without editorializing. "Gerald Fitch," Colton said. "You know him?" "I know of him. He runs a lending operation. He's been around the county a long time." He looked at the table. "Did he approach you?" "No, he just looked." "That's worse sometimes," Colton said. She agreed, but didn't say so. "I want you to know that whatever he's doing in town, whatever he decides to say about me, the arrangement your first wife's parents have made and whatever Gerald Fitch decides to stir up, those aren't the same problem, but they might become useful to each other." Colton was quiet for a moment. "You think clearly," he said. It wasn't flattery. It was the tone of someone observing something that surprised them slightly. "I've had to," Eleanor said. He nodded. Something in his face wanted to ask more about that, and he held it back, and she was grateful. 2 days later, Harlan Voss came to the ranch. He arrived in a carriage that was too fine for ranch roads and that had clearly had a difficult transit showing in the mud along its sides, which Eleanor suspected did not improve his mood. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had been told he was important often enough that he'd stopped questioning it. He stood on the front porch in a wool coat that cost more than Eleanor's monthly wage, and he looked at the house and then at Eleanor, who had answered the door, with eyes that did an inventory and came to a conclusion. "I'm here to see Colton," he said. "He's in the south pasture," Eleanor said. "I've sent someone to get him. Would you like to come in?" His eyes did the inventory again.
You're the woman he's hired. Eleanor Hale. Yes. He came in without thanking her for the invitation, sat in the front parlor without being shown to it, and declined coffee without looking at her when he did. Eleanor went to the kitchen and stood there for a moment and breathed deliberately, because there was something about Harlan Voss that made a room feel smaller in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. Rosa was at the stove. She glanced at Eleanor. Voss? Yes. Rosa turned back to the stove. He came twice before in the summer. Both times Colton was out. Both times he said he'd come back. She stirred something. He waited both times. Longer than a man should wait if he just wants to see his grandchildren. Eleanor absorbed this. Where are the boys? Back room. Drawing. Keep them there, Eleanor said. Colton arrived 20 minutes later. Not hurried, but not slow. He'd had time to read the situation on the way in, and he came through the front door already composed, which Eleanor suspected cost him something. She heard them from the kitchen, Harlan's voice low and deliberate, Colton's shorter and more controlled. She was not trying to listen. The kitchen was simply not far enough away. The boys need stability, Harlan said. Real stability. Not this arrangement you've put together out of desperation. The boys are fine, Colton said. Owen has nightmares. You said so yourself in your letter in September. All children have nightmares. Dorothea is not well, Harlan said, and his voice changed on his wife's name in a way that suggested this was the real center of the conversation, whatever else surrounded it. She lost her daughter. She needs her grandchildren in the city to feel better about losing her daughter, Colton said. I understand that, but the boys live here. This is their home. You have a hired woman you've known for 6 weeks. She's not just... Colton stopped. Started again. Miss Hale has done more for my sons in 6 weeks than anyone has managed in 8 months. I won't apologize for that. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to consider what a judge would think when he looks at the situation. A grieving widower, 2 traumatized children, a woman of no particular family or standing moved into the house. Don't, Colton said. The word was quiet and very clear. A pause. Then Harlan's voice adjusted slightly. I'm not your enemy, Colton. No, Colton said. But you're not here because you're my friend either. Eleanor stopped listening after that because Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway and she needed him to stay there. Is that Grandpa Harlan? Owen said. Yes. He smells like the stuff in the medicine cabinet, Owen said. Come help me with the bread, Eleanor said. She moved him toward the table and got him busy with dough that didn't strictly need kneading at this point, but was an excellent occupation for small hands. Eli appeared behind Owen a moment later, and Eleanor set him up with a bowl of dried beans to sort, which was not a task that needed doing, but kept his hands occupied, and she stood between the two of them and the sound of voices from the front room and worked the bread herself and kept her breathing even. Harlan left an hour later. Colton came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at his sons at the table, Owen explaining something to Eli about the correct way to make a fist in a snowball, Eli listening with the polite tolerance of someone who already knew this but was being kind enough not to say so. And Eleanor saw his face do the thing it did when he looked at them sometimes, the thing he didn't know she saw. I need to go into town tomorrow, Colton said. See a lawyer. Good, Eleanor said. He looked at her. That's all you're going to say? What else would you like me to say? He almost smiled. Nothing, he said. Nothing else. The lawyer's name was Franklin Beyer, and Walt was the one who told Eleanor about him, the next morning over coffee, while Colton was in town. Good man, Walt said. Sharp. He's handled Colton's ranch business for years. If anyone can figure out the Voss angle, it's Beyer. What is the Voss angle? Eleanor said. Walt looked at her with the measuring look she'd become familiar with. Railroad, he said. The Central Valley line is buying up route access all along the valley. Most of the small ranchers sold. Colton didn't. The route that makes the most sense, the one the surveyors keep coming back to, cuts right through the northeast corner of the Mercer land. And if the Voss family had custody of the boys,
They'd control the trust that controls the land until the boys are grown, Walt said.
Harlan Voss has had dealings with the railroad before. Land dealings. Eleanor set down her coffee. How long have you known this? Had a feeling for a while, Walt said. Talked to a man from the surveying office last month. He confirmed the route. You should tell Colton. I will, Walt said. Wanted to have it solid first. He looked at her. I'm telling you because you're going to need to know it too. Whatever happens next. She wasn't sure what to do with that. The implication that whatever happened next included her specifically, that Walt had placed her somewhere in his assessment of the situation that was more than hired help. She didn't ask him to clarify because she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. Colton came back from town late in the afternoon. He came into the kitchen and sat down and ran both hands through his hair, and Eleanor put coffee in front of him without asking. Buyer says their case is thin, he said, but thin isn't nothing. A temporary order is possible, which means the boys could be placed with the Vosses while the full case is heard, and the full case could take months. Eleanor sat down. A temporary order. If a judge agrees there's sufficient concern for the boys' welfare in the current arrangement. He looked at the table. The current arrangement being me and you, and no particularly conventional explanation for why you're here. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up in the way it did in the afternoons now, hitting the north side of the house. What does Buyer recommend? Eleanor said. Colton looked up. He looked at her the way he had on the platform at Redstone Station. Directly, with the particular honesty of someone who has run out of time and useful pretense. He says the clearest way to neutralize the welfare argument is to demonstrate that the boys have a stable two-parent household. He paused. He was suggesting I remarry. Eleanor kept her face still. He wasn't suggesting anyone specific, Colton said. He was talking generally. But you're not, Eleanor said. No, he said. I'm not. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about $8.40 and a wrist bruise and a train she hadn't boarded. She thought about Eli's forehead on her shoulder in the dark and Owen's question. Did it get better? She thought about the drawing pinned to the kitchen wall and the paper and pencils she left on the table every morning. This would be different from what you asked me on the platform, she said. Yes. On the platform you were asking me to help your sons. This is asking me to help your legal case. It's both, he said. I'm not going to pretend it's only one thing. She appreciated that. She'd have liked him less if he'd tried. I need you to understand something, she said. I came from a situation where a man treated me as a means to an end, where the thing I was willing to do and the thing I actually was were not a consideration. She looked at him steadily. I will not go back to that. I know, he said. Do you? I know, he said again, and said it differently the second time, with the weight of someone who had actually considered what it meant. What I'm asking, I know it's not fair. I know you've got no particular reason to... He stopped, started again, rougher, less careful. Eleanor, these boys, I can't lose them. I cannot lose my sons to a legal argument about railroad routes that has nothing to do with whether I'm a good father or whether they're safe or whether they're loved. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not breaking. He wasn't a man who let things break in front of other people, but close to the edge of something. I know what I'm asking. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the stove ticked. The wind hit the north wall. We'd need to be honest with each other, she said, about everything. I can't go into something like this and find out later there are things you haven't told me. Agreed. And the boys can't know it's a strategy. If we do this, we do it as a real thing, for them. That's what I want, he said. I'm not asking you to perform something. I'm asking you to... He stopped again. There was something on his face that he clearly had not prepared to say, and was saying anyway. I'm asking you to stay. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She looked at the face of a man who had not slept through a full night in 8 months, who blamed himself for his wife's death with the specific cruel precision of the genuinely guilty, who had driven to a train station on insufficient sleep because someone had told him she might be a woman in a desperate situation, which meant she might understand his. All right, she said. He exhaled. Just slightly. Just enough.
"There's something else you should know," he said. "Walt spoke to me this afternoon about the railroad survey." "I know," Eleanor said. "He told me this morning." Colton looked at her. Then he almost laughed. The second time she'd seen that, the almost laugh, and both times it arrived unexpectedly and changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less guarded and like the person he might have been before 8 months of grief finished doing its work on him. "Of course he did," Colton said. "He trusts you," Eleanor said. "He told me because he thought I should know." "That's a different thing." "Walt's never trusted anyone that fast." "I bake," Eleanor said. "It accelerates things." This time he did laugh. Brief, quiet, surprised out of him. She looked at her coffee cup and kept her face neutral, but it cost her something. They told Walt the next morning. He received the news with the same expression he received most information, which was to say he looked at it carefully from all sides before committing to a response. Then he said, "Good," and went to find his hat, which was the warmest possible reception Eleanor suspected Walt had ever offered anything. They told Rosa an hour later. Rosa looked at Eleanor and then at Colton and then back at Eleanor and said, "About time," which was not what either of them had expected and which required no response because Rosa had already moved on to discussing what needed to be done about the state of the good dishes in the cabinet if there was going to be any kind of occasion that warranted their use. Eleanor wrote to Franklin Byers' office that afternoon to begin whatever documentation was needed. She wrote carefully and factually and without sentiment. She signed her name at the bottom and looked at it for a moment before folding the letter. She had not written to Gerald Fitch. She had not heard from Gerald Fitch directly. But the afternoon she went into town to post the letter to Byers' office, she saw him again, not across the street this time, but inside the post office itself, talking to the clerk with the particular sociable ease of a man who had been talking to that clerk for years. He saw Eleanor. She saw him see her. He smiled at her. It was a small smile, the kind that meant he knew something she didn't, or wanted her to think he did. She posted her letter and left without acknowledging him. She was almost back to the wagon when a woman fell into step beside her. 50s, sharp-eyed, with a hat that was practical rather than fashionable. "You're the Hale woman," she said, not unkindly, factual. "I am," Eleanor said. "I'm Agnes Purdy. I run the schoolhouse." She matched Eleanor's pace. "I've seen your boys." Eleanor noted the possessive without commenting on it. "Owen and Eli." "Owen mostly. He came with Walt Grady once when Walt had business in town. Smart boy." She paused. "Talks a lot." "He does," Eleanor agreed. "The Voss family has been speaking to people in town," Agnes Purdy said. "To the Reverend, and to Judge Alderman's clerk. They're preparing an argument." She said this the way Eleanor imagined she said most things, directly, without the softening that would have made it more comfortable and less useful. "I don't know those children well, but I know Harlan Voss. I've lived in this county 30 years. She stopped walking. Eleanor stopped too, and they stood on the frozen street looking at each other. "If you need character testimony from someone who isn't on Mercer's payroll and doesn't owe him anything, you can use my name." Eleanor looked at her. "Why?" Agnes Purdy considered the question with what appeared to be genuine respect for it. "Because Harlan Voss tried to buy the school land in 1887, and I blocked him," she said. "And because I saw that boy Owen look at you across the street the day you were in town last week, and the way he looked at you told me everything I needed to know about how those children are being raised right now." She pulled her coat tighter. "Send word to the schoolhouse if you need me." She walked away without waiting for a response, which Eleanor suspected was simply how Agnes Purdy operated. Eleanor stood on the frozen street for a moment. Then she got into the wagon and drove home. She told Colton about Agnes Purdy that evening. He knew her. Of course he did. 14 years in a county the size of theirs meant you knew everyone, or knew of them. And something in his face when she mentioned the school land told her there was more to that history than Agnes had shared. "She'll do what she says," he said. "She's not a woman who offers things she doesn't deliver." "I know," Eleanor said. "I could tell." They were in the front parlor, which Eleanor had begun using in the evenings because the kitchen belonged to the daytime, and the back rooms belonged to the boys, and the parlor was the one room in the house that was neutral territory. The fire was lit. Outside, snow had begun. The first real snow of the season, The kind that didn't look like much but piled quietly and without announcement until morning revealed what it had done while no one was watching. "Tell me something," Eleanor said. She'd been thinking about this since the conversation about Bayer, about what she'd said. Be honest about everything. And what she had offered as a condition she had not herself met. "What did you tell the lawyer about me? How did you describe the situation?" Colton looked at the fire. "The truth," he said, "that you were a woman in a difficult circumstance when I met you, that I asked you to come here as a caretaker, that you've done more for my sons than I had any right to expect." He paused. He asked if there was more to it than employment, and I told him I thought there might be. Eleanor considered this. "When did you think that?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the same stripped-down honesty he'd used on the train platform, the quality that she had believed then and still believed now. "About a week in," he said. "When you told Owen it got different, not better. I was in the hallway. You didn't know I was there." He looked at her. "I'd been telling him for 8 months that it got better, that things were going to be all right, because that's what you say. And he'd been hearing me say it and knowing it wasn't quite true, and you said the true thing, and I heard him actually believe you." He paused again. "I started paying attention after that." Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. The fire settled. The snow outside continued its quiet business. "I should tell you something," she said, "about Gerald Fitch, the actual situation." She had told him the outline, the debt, the arranged marriage, the wrist on the platform. She had not told him the extent of it. She told him now, the full 6 weeks, the specific amounts, the particular quality of Gerald's certainty that she had nowhere to go. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she'd learned to tell uncomfortable things, as information rather than appeal. When she finished, Colton was quiet for a moment. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working to keep his expression controlled. "He has no legal claim on you," he said finally. "Bayer can confirm that." "I know, but he's in town and he's talking to people, and whatever he's saying will be useful to the Voss family's argument if they find out about it. Then we make sure Bayer knows the full picture first." He looked at her directly. "Whatever they throw, we don't get surprised. That's the only way to manage it." "Agreed," she said. They both looked at the fire for a while after that. The snow was coming heavier now, visible past the parlor window, the kind of snow that meant tomorrow would require work on the ranch before anything else. "I never asked you," Colton said, "what you would have wanted, before all of this, before your father's debts. What were you planning for yourself?" Eleanor thought about it. She hadn't been asked this in years, maybe ever. "I wanted a bookshop," she said. "I know that's not—" She paused. "I'm good with accounts. I always had a head for numbers and for what people actually wanted when they said they wanted something. I thought maybe a small shop somewhere with books and ledgers and a cat." "A cat," Colton said. "Every good bookshop has a cat." He looked at her with an expression that she could not entirely read, something in it that was serious and something that was warm and something that was careful in a way that meant he was aware of what he was feeling and not yet sure what to do with it. "I don't have a bookshop," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I have a ranch and 2 boys and a legal problem and about a foot of snow on the way." "I know that too," she said. "And you're still here." She looked at him steadily. "I'm still here," she said. Outside, the snow kept falling on Mercer Ranch, silent and indifferent and thorough, covering everything that had happened before in a white that looked clean but was mostly just new. Inside, 2 adults sat by a fire and looked at each other across a space that was slightly smaller than it had been that morning, and said nothing more, and that was enough for tonight. 3 days later, Colton Mercer and Eleanor Hale went into town and spoke to Franklin Bayer about the paperwork that would make what was happening at Mercer Ranch official in the eyes of the law. That was when things stopped being manageable and started being a fight. Franklin Bayer's office smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, and it was warm in the specific aggressive way of rooms heated by men who ran cold and didn't consider whether anyone else in the room might not. Eleanor sat in the chair across from his desk and kept her coat on for the first 10 minutes until the heat became undeniable, and Bayer talked, and she listened and understood within the first quarter hour that he was a good lawyer and also that the situation was worse than Colton had summarized. "The Voss family filed 3 days ago," Bayer said. He was a compact man in his 60s with the unhurried manner of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. Judge Alderman received the petition yesterday. I got a copy this morning. Colton sat very still in the chair beside Eleanor. What grounds? Parental instability, inadequate supervisory continuity, meaning the succession of housekeepers, environmental isolation. Byer put on his glasses and looked at the document in front of him. And this. He slid a paper across the desk. Colton picked it up. Eleanor watched his face read it and go carefully blank. What is it? She said. He handed it to her without speaking. It was a signed statement from Gerald Fitch. It described Eleanor Hale as a woman of unstable circumstances and questionable character who had abandoned a legitimate contractual obligation, the debt arrangement, through deception and flight. It described her relationship to Colton Mercer as one of financial opportunism. It used the word manipulative twice. It was signed and notarized, which meant Gerald had been planning this for longer than Eleanor had given him credit for. She set the paper back on Byer's desk. Her hands were steady. This is not accurate, she said. I know that, Byer said, but accuracy is one thing and a signed statement is another. In a custody hearing, a judge reads character testimony with significant weight. He looked at her over his glasses. I need to know everything, not the summary. Everything. Start with how you met Mr. Mercer. Eleanor told him. All of it. The debts, the arrangement, Gerald's hand on her wrist, the station. She left out nothing, because she had promised Colton she wouldn't be the source of surprises, and that included surprises to the man defending them. Byer listened without interrupting, making occasional notes in a hand so small she couldn't read it from across the desk. When she finished, he said, The wrist. Yes. Did anyone see it? She thought. The porter at the station, 2 women on the platform, and Colton. Byer looked at Colton. You saw it? Yes, Colton said. His voice had an edge on it. I'll need a statement from you, dated close to the incident. Byer made a note. The porter is unlikely to be useful. He won't remember. But if those women are traceable... Martha Greer sent me to Eleanor, Colton said. She was at the station that morning. She's the one who told me about Eleanor's situation. Byer wrote that down. Martha Greer. She has the dress shop? Yes. I know her. She'll hold up. Byer set down his pen. Here's the problem I need you both to understand. The Voss family's attorney is a man named Caldwell, Terrence Caldwell, from the city. He is experienced and thorough, and he is going to present a narrative in that courtroom about what Mercer Ranch looks like from the outside. And from the outside, it looks like this. A wealthy, grieving rancher, a rotating cast of hired women who couldn't manage the situation, and then a woman of no family or standing who arrived with almost nothing and is now legally married to the wealthiest man in the county after less than 2 months. He looked at both of them evenly. That narrative is not hard to sell to a judge who doesn't know you. Then we make sure the judge knows us, Eleanor said. Byer looked at her. That is exactly right, he said. And it is harder than it sounds, because Caldwell is good, and because the Voss family is going to bring Margaret into this. They're going to use her death. They're going to describe a man so consumed by guilt that he made a series of desperate decisions, the most recent being bringing a stranger into his children's home and giving her legal authority over them. He paused. I'm telling you this so you're not sitting in that courtroom hearing it for the first time and reacting. Colton said nothing for a moment. Then, what do you need from us? Character witnesses who are not on your payroll, documentation of the boy's condition before and after Eleanor's arrival. If Rosa has observations, I want them in writing. I want Agnes Purdy, if she's willing. He glanced at Eleanor. She approached you? Yes. Good. She's respected. She'll help. He picked up his pen again. I also want the railroad survey information. Walt has it? He has a contact at the survey office, Colton said. I need documentation, names, dates, correspondence if there is any, between the survey office and anyone connected to the Voss family. He looked at Colton steadily. Because if I can demonstrate to Judge Alderman that this custody petition is not about 2 grieving grandparents and their love for their late daughter's children, but is instead about acquiring land rights worth significantly more than anyone in this room is comfortable stating out loud, the entire complexion of the case changes. Eleanor thought of Harlan Voss in the parlor with his fine wool coat and his inventory eyes. "Can you do that?" she said. "Demonstrate it?" "I can try," Byer said, "which is the most honest answer I can give you." He took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. Judge Alderman has agreed to hear it in the county seat rather than sending it to the city, which is in our favor. He knows this community. He's less likely to be impressed by the Voss family's presentation than a city judge who doesn't know what a working ranch looks like or what kind of community produces a woman like Agnes Purdy." He looked at both of them. "Go home. Let me work. Send Walt to me with the survey information. And—" He paused. "Prepare the boys." Colton looked up. "What do you mean?" "Alderman may want to speak with them, informally. He's not going to put 4-year-olds on a witness stand, but he has in the past asked to see children in chambers, briefly, just to read the room." Byer's expression was careful. "It's not standard, but Alderman is not a standard judge. He believes he can read children better than testimony, and in my experience with him, he's not wrong." They drove home mostly in silence. The snow from the previous week had packed down on the road, and the horses moved carefully, and Eleanor watched the fence lines pass and thought about 3 weeks and Terence Caldwell and the specific sound Gerald Fitch's voice made in her memory when he'd said, "You'll come crawling back." "I should have moved faster," Colton said. "On what?" "On all of it. I knew Harlan was circling since August. I told myself it was grief, that he'd come around, that I could manage it quietly." He kept his eyes on the road. "I was wrong." "You were managing your sons and a ranch in the middle of winter," Eleanor said. "You were doing what you could with what you had." "That sounds like something you say to someone who needs comfort," he said. "Not what you actually think." She looked at him sideways. "What I actually think is that you waited longer than you should have and that it created problems you're now going to have to deal with," she said. "And that beating yourself up about it between now and the hearing is going to make you less useful in that courtroom, which is the one place you need to be functional." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not easy to talk to," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I mean that as a compliment." "I know," she said. "I took it as one." They told the boys about the hearing that evening after dinner in the sitting room with the fire going and both boys in their nightclothes because Eleanor had found that difficult conversations were slightly easier when everyone was already in pajamas. She and Colton had agreed on what to say and how to say it, which was an agreement reached in about 4 minutes because they had, somewhere in the last several weeks, developed the ability to read each other's thinking on things that mattered. Colton did the talking. Eleanor sat on the floor with Owen leaning against her knee and Eli sitting close enough to touch, but not quite touching, which was Eli's version of close. "Your Grandpa Harlan has asked a judge to decide where you should live," Colton said. He said it plainly, without softening it so much that it became something other than what it was. "The judge is going to ask me and Eleanor some questions. He might want to talk to you too, not in a scary way, just to say hello and tell him about yourselves." Owen said, "Does Grandpa Harlan want us to live with him?" "Yes." Owen looked at Eleanor, then back at his father. "I don't want to," he said. "I want to stay here." "I know you do," Colton said, "and that's what we're working on." Eli had been very still and very quiet through all of this, which was not unusual for Eli, but there was a quality to the stillness that Eleanor recognized as processing rather than withdrawal. She waited. "Will you lose?" Eli said. He looked at Colton when he said it. Colton didn't flinch from the directness. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen." Eli considered this. "That's not what I asked." Colton looked at his son for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. "I'm going to try very hard." Eli looked at Eleanor. "I'm going to try very hard too," Eleanor said. Eli nodded once. He leaned sideways until his shoulder was touching Eleanor's arm. Not quite leaning on her, just touching. Eleanor kept very still and let him stay there. That night after the boys were in bed, she and Colton sat in the kitchen and she made notes on a piece of paper. Every witness, every piece of documentation, everything she could think of that Byer might find useful and hadn't thought to ask for. Colton watched her write. "You would have been good at running a business," he said.
"I know," Eleanor said, without looking up. He almost smiled. "The bookshop." "The bookshop," she confirmed. She sent 4 letters the next morning, one to Buyer with her notes, one to Agnes Purdy with a date and a request, one to Martha Greer asking if she'd be willing to give a statement, and one, which she thought about for a long time before writing, to a woman she'd known slightly in her old town, a widow named Clara Sten, who had once worked for a land office and who knew more about how property transactions were documented in this county than probably anyone outside of a courtroom. She wasn't sure Clara could help. She wrote the letter anyway. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Eleanor's life, and she had had some long weeks. Walt rode to Buyer's office twice with documents Eleanor had helped him organize: survey maps, a surveyor's letter to a business associate that mentioned the Voss family name in a context that was not grandparental warmth, and a record of 3 land transactions in the county from 1889 in which a Voss family holding company had been the buyer. None of it was a smoking gun. All of it was a pattern. Rosa wrote her statement at the kitchen table one afternoon and handed it to Eleanor without comment. It was 2 pages in Rosa's careful, precise handwriting, describing in specific detail the condition of the household and the children before Eleanor's arrival and after. She described the nightmares. She described the meals Owen had refused and the months of Eli's near silence. She described, with the same absence of sentiment she brought to everything, the kitchen on Eleanor's second evening, 2 small boys counting salt pinches with total seriousness, while a woman made biscuits like it was the most important thing in the room, because for those boys it was. Eleanor read it in the barn because she needed somewhere to be alone. Agnes Purdy came to the ranch on a Thursday and spent 2 hours with Eleanor and Colton at the kitchen table going through her testimony. She was precise and economical, and she had, it turned out, more information about Harlan Voss's land dealings than even Walt had assembled. 30 years in a county meant you paid attention, and Agnes Purdy was constitutionally incapable of not paying attention. "He offered to fund the school expansion in 1891, Agnes said, with conditions. The conditions included the school board supporting certain zoning recommendations. She looked at her teacup. I declined. He found another way around it. She looked up. He always finds another way around it. That's what Buyer needs to demonstrate. That this is how Harlan Voss operates, not through direct confrontation, but through finding the leverage point and applying pressure there." She glanced at Eleanor. "In this case, the leverage point is those children." "I know," Eleanor said. "You're the new leverage point," Agnes said. "If Caldwell can discredit you, the rest of the case gets easier for them. They won't come after Colton directly. He's too established, too known. They'll go through you." Eleanor had already understood this. It was useful to hear it said plainly. "Then we make sure there's nothing to find," she said. "There's always something to find," Agnes said. "The question is whether what they find matters." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "The Fitch statement is a problem, not because it's true, but because it exists. Caldwell will use it to paint a picture. Buyer's job is to paint a different picture before Caldwell finishes with his." Clara Stain wrote back 6 days before the hearing. Her letter was 3 pages, and it was exactly what Eleanor had hoped for. Documentation of a land transaction from 1890 in which a company with Voss family connections had acquired mineral rights on property along the proposed Central Valley survey route 6 months before the survey was officially announced. 6 months before the survey was public knowledge, which meant someone had known about the route in advance and that someone had connections to both the railroad and the county land office. Eleanor read the letter twice and then went directly to Buyer's office and sat across from his desk and watched him read it. He read it twice. He set it down. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I wrote to someone who used to work for the land office," Eleanor said. Buyer looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was several things at once. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, using the name for the first time, she noted, and with a particular emphasis that suggested he was reminding himself as much as telling her. "This is significant." "I thought it might be," she said. "I need to verify it. I have a contact at the land office who owes me a long-standing professional courtesy." He picked up the letter again. "If this holds up—" "It will hold up," Eleanor said. "Clara doesn't make claims she can't document." "Then it changes the shape of what I do in that courtroom." He set the letter down carefully.
You should know. Caldwell filed an additional witness statement yesterday from a man named Gerald Fitch. I know about Gerald Fitch, Eleanor said. He's willing to testify in person, not just a written statement. Byer looked at her. He'll be in the courtroom. Eleanor kept her face still. Something in her chest went cold, and then, because she was Eleanor Hale and she had learned that cold was not the same as stopped, steadied. Then I'll be in the courtroom too, she said. The hearing was on a Tuesday, 10 in the morning, at the county courthouse, a building that smelled of old wood and lemon oil and the specific institutional cold of rooms that were heated only when in use. Eleanor wore her best dress, which was the not quite practical one she'd hung in the narrow wardrobe on her first day, and she had pressed it the night before until her arms ached, and it was as close to right as she could get it, without resources she didn't have. Colton had worn his good suit. He looked uncomfortable in it, in the way that men who spent most of their lives outdoors look uncomfortable in good suits, like the clothes were making demands the man inside them couldn't quite answer. Eleanor had straightened his collar in the front hallway that morning without thinking, and he'd gone very still for a moment and let her, and neither of them had said anything about it. The boys had stayed at the ranch with Rosa and Walt. Owen had insisted on giving Eleanor one of his drawings to take with her, a horse, hastily rendered, with something that might have been a person on its back. For luck, he said, with the absolute conviction of a child who has decided something is true. She had folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. The courtroom was not large. Judge Alderman was 60-something, gray-bearded, with the kind of face that gave very little away but watched everything. He had, Eleanor thought, good eyes, the kind that had looked at enough people telling him things to have developed an accurate internal instrument for what was true and what was constructed. The Voss family sat on the other side of the room, Harlan Voss in the same fine coat. A woman beside him who must be Dorothea, older than Eleanor had imagined, smaller, with the particular thinned-out quality of someone who had been through something that had not left enough behind. Eleanor looked at Dorothea Voss and felt, unexpectedly, something that was not anger. Next to Harlan sat Terence Caldwell. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, early 40s, sharp-dressed, with the relaxed alertness of a man who was good at his work and knew it. And 3 rows back, Gerald Fitch. He was watching Eleanor with the small, satisfied expression of a man who had been waiting for an opportunity and believed it had arrived. Eleanor looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at Judge Alderman and did not look at Gerald Fitch again. Caldwell opened with the narrative Byer had predicted, and he was as good as advertised. He described a household in crisis, the rotating housekeepers, the traumatized children, the grieving father making desperate decisions. He described Eleanor with the specific gentleness of a man who wanted to seem fair while being effective. Not a bad woman, the implication went, but a woman of uncertain circumstance and very convenient timing, who had managed in the space of 2 months to go from a near stranger on a train platform to a legal co-guardian of children worth considerably more than she had ever had access to before. It was a good performance. Eleanor watched the judge's face while Caldwell delivered it, and tried to read what was landing and what wasn't, and couldn't quite tell, which meant Alderman was as good as Byer said. Byer was quieter in his opening and more specific. He named names and dates and amounts. He did not editorialize. He presented the railroad survey information and the land transaction record and the timeline of the Voss family's escalating interest in custody against the timeline of the survey route becoming increasingly public knowledge. He let the correlation speak without turning it into argument. Alderman listened with his hands folded on the bench and his expression unchanged throughout both openings. Gerald Fitch was the first witness Caldwell called. He settled into the chair with the ease of a man who considered himself comfortable in public settings, and he told his story with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it. The debt arrangement, the broken commitment, Eleanor's flight, her sudden appearance in the house of a wealthy rancher. He was careful to stay close enough to facts that objection was difficult, and far enough from the worst implications that he could claim restraint. Byer cross-examined him with the unhurried patience of someone who had been waiting specifically for this. "Mr. Fitch," he said, "you've described a contractual obligation. Can you show me the contract?"
A pause. It was a verbal arrangement. A verbal arrangement between yourself and a deceased man, the nature of which you are reporting here as established fact. The debt was real. The debt, perhaps. The obligation you claim transfers from the debt to Miss Hale, now Mrs. Mercer. That is what I'm asking about. The document establishing that she personally was liable. Another pause. Longer. There was an understanding, Buyer said. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Fitch. He sat down. Gerald's face had done something in the course of that exchange that no amount of composure could entirely repair, and Eleanor, who was watching from beside Colton, saw Judge Alderman notice it. Martha Greer took the stand next for Byers' side. She was matter-of-fact and thorough, and she described what she had seen on the platform at Redstone Station, the hand on Eleanor's wrist, the marks, Eleanor's face, with the specific observational detail of a woman who made a living noting what things looked like and how they fit. Caldwell tried to suggest she had misread the situation. Martha Greer looked at him the way women who have worked with fabric for 30 years look at poor craftsmanship. I know a grip mark when I see one, she said. I have several sisters. Agnes Purdy was the third witness, and she was extraordinary. She was calm, and she was precise, and she answered only what was asked in exactly as many words as the answer required, which was the most effective possible approach to a courtroom because it gave Caldwell nothing extra to work with. She described the school land offer, the conditions attached to it, the pattern of Harlan Voss's land dealings in the county over 30 years. She described the timeline of the survey route against the timeline of the Voss family's interest in their grandchildren. You're characterizing Mr. Voss's motives, Caldwell said. I'm describing his actions, Agnes said. Over 30 years. Motives are your department, Mr. Caldwell. I'm a school teacher. Colton spoke after lunch. He stood up there in his good suit, and he did not look comfortable, and he did not pretend to, and Eleanor thought that was exactly right for this room, for this judge. He talked about Margaret, not for sympathy, just as context, because the story of the ranch and the boys didn't make sense without her in it. He talked about his own failures, because Byer had told him to, and because it was true, and because a man who stands in a courtroom and accounts for his failures without flinching is a different proposition from a man trying to manage his image. I told her to stay, Colton said. In October, when the weather was turning and she wasn't well, I told her the trip to town was too risky in the weather that was coming. I was wrong. That is the fact of it, and I don't have anything to add to it. I was wrong, and I have lived with that every day since. Alderman was looking at him the way he'd been looking at everything, carefully, without expression. I am not a perfect father, Colton said. I forget things. I get caught up in the work. My boys had bad months after their mother died, and I wasn't enough to make those months better. He paused. Eleanor was. Eleanor came in, and she didn't try to replace Margaret. She didn't try to manage what was happening and smooth it over. She sat on the floor with my sons, and she told them the truth about hard things, and she made them feel safe enough to feel what they were actually feeling. He looked at the judge. My boys started to come back to themselves. That is what I can tell you. Eleanor testified after Colton. She had been prepared for Caldwell to come at her through Gerald Fitch's statement, and through the speed of the marriage, and through every surface implication about who she was and what she wanted. He did. He was polite about it, and specific and thorough, and she answered every question he asked with the same level voice she'd used on train platforms, and in barns, and in kitchens when things needed to be said plainly. Mrs. Mercer, Caldwell said, with the careful gentleness that was his most effective weapon, isn't it true that when you arrived at Mercer Ranch you had less than $10 to your name? Yes, Eleanor said. And that you had left behind a financial obligation you had verbally committed to meeting? No, Eleanor said. I had not committed to anything. My father had. But you were willing to marry Mr. Fitch to settle that obligation. I was considering it, Eleanor said, because I didn't see another option at the time. Finding another option is not the same as abandoning a commitment. And the option you found was moving into a wealthy man's home. The option I found was caring for 2 children who needed someone to care for them, Eleanor said. I did that for 6 weeks before anything else was discussed. I did it because they needed it.
If you'd like to ask Rosa Sandoval what state those boys were in before I arrived and what they looked like 6 weeks later, she's here and she's already submitted a written account. Caldwell moved on. He always moved on when a witness didn't flinch. The last thing that happened that afternoon, the thing that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life with a sharpness that time didn't soften, was Owen and Eli. Byer had told them Alderman might want to see the boys. Colton had driven back to the ranch at the lunch recess to collect them, and they came in through the back of the courtroom in their good clothes, Owen with his hair combed into a shape it immediately began to depart from, Eli wearing the coat with the right buttons. Alderman called a brief informal recess. He spoke to the boys in the open courtroom rather than in chambers, which was his choice and which put Caldwell and the Voss family directly in the line of sight. He crouched down to their level, which Eleanor had not expected from a man his age and his gravity, and he asked them simply and in plain language how things were at home. Owen told him about Bucket's Tuesday adventure. Alderman listened to the complete account with what appeared to be genuine interest. Then he asked Owen where he wanted to live. Home, Owen said. Like the question had a self-evident answer. With Papa and Eleanor. Alderman looked at Eli. Eli had been watching this exchange with his usual focused attention. Alderman waited. The courtroom was very quiet. "Please don't take us away again," Eli said. He looked at the judge with his father's eyes and said it with the particular clarity of a child who does not have the resources for anything but the exact truth. 6 words, simple, complete. Eleanor heard something happen in the room around her. Not a sound exactly. More like a collective shift in the quality of the air. Alderman straightened up slowly. He looked at the boys for a moment. Then he looked at Harlan Voss, who was sitting very still with his fine coat and his 30 years of land dealings and his legitimate grief for his daughter, and who was looking at his grandsons with an expression that Eleanor could not entirely read, something in it that was almost something other than what he had walked into this room representing. Dorothea Voss had her hand pressed to her mouth. Alderman said he would have his ruling by Thursday morning, and he left the bench, and the courtroom released its held breath in a low, accumulated sound. Colton stood up, and his sons came to him, and he put his arms around them both and held on. Eleanor stood beside him, and Owen reached sideways and grabbed her hand, and she held that too, and the 4 of them stood in the middle of the county courthouse while Terence Caldwell gathered his papers and Gerald Fitch made his way to the door, and Harlan Voss put his hand on his wife's back and walked her out without looking back. Thursday felt like a very long time from Tuesday. But Tuesday night, driving home in the dark with the boys asleep against each other in the back of the wagon, Colton reached across and covered Eleanor's hand with his. Not romantically, not with any performance. Just the hand of a man who needed to acknowledge that someone had stood beside him through something hard and had not stepped back. She turned her hand over and held his. They drove home through the cold like that and said nothing, and the dark ranch road opened up ahead of the horses, and Thursday would come when it came. Wednesday was the kind of day that had no business being as ordinary as it was. Eleanor came down at 5:30 and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the dark outside do nothing in particular, and then she made oatmeal because it was something to do with her hands. And Owen appeared in the doorway at 6 with his hair doing its usual morning departure from the shape she'd combed it into the night before, and he said, "Is today Thursday?" "No," Eleanor said. "Today is Wednesday." He considered this. "How long is Wednesday?" "Same as any other day." He sat down at the table and looked at his oatmeal with the expression of someone who has been told a weight is finite but cannot yet see the far end of it. "Walt says the judge will say yes," he said. "Walt says judges look at kids and they always let kids go home." Eleanor sat down across from him. "Walt is usually right about things," she said, "but nobody knows for certain until Thursday." "Do you think he'll say yes?" She looked at her son. She had started thinking of him that way, somewhere in the last month, and had not yet decided what to do with that. And she told him the truth the way she always tried to. "I think we gave the judge everything he needed to say yes," she said. "The rest is his to decide." Owen looked at his oatmeal, then he looked up. "Are you scared?" "Yes," Eleanor said. He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. "Me too," he said. Eli's scared, but he won't say it. I know, Eleanor said. Eli has his own way of carrying things. Like the heavy thing, Owen said, getting stronger holding it. He remembered everything, this boy, filed it away and brought it back at the exact moment it was needed. Yeah, he said. Okay. He ate his oatmeal. Eli came down 20 minutes later and sat beside his brother and ate his oatmeal too, and neither boy said anything about Thursday, and Eleanor let the morning be what it was, ordinary and insufficient, and the only thing any of them had to work with. Colton came in from the barn at 7 with mud on his boots and the specific look of a man who had been up since 4 doing physical work because lying in bed thinking was not something he was built to tolerate. He poured coffee and sat at the table and looked at his sons, and Eleanor saw on his face the expression she had learned was the one he wore when something mattered so much he was keeping it locked down hard, because the alternative was something he didn't have a framework for. Fence on the north line needs repairing, he said, to no one in particular. It'll keep until Friday, Walt said from the doorway, because Walt had apparently been awake as long as Colton and had the same idea about productive activity as an alternative to thinking. He came in and poured his own coffee and sat down and looked at the boys. You two want to come see if the ice is thick enough on the lower pond to walk on. Owen's face changed entirely. Is it? Only one way to find out, Walt said. Can we? Owen looked at Colton. Boots and coats, Colton said. The boys disappeared up the stairs at a speed that suggested Wednesday had just become considerably more manageable. Eleanor looked at Walt across the table. He didn't look back. He was studying his coffee cup, but the deliberateness of the offer had been plain enough. Get the boys out of the house. Let the adults have a day that wasn't about waiting in front of children who were waiting too. She said, Thank you, Walt. Ice won't check itself, he said, and drank his coffee. The day passed the way days do when you are waiting for something, in irregular patches of time that didn't correspond to the actual clock. Eleanor washed every dish in the house. She reorganized the pantry, which didn't need reorganizing but tolerated it. She wrote 2 letters she'd been putting off, one to a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 2 years, and one to Martha Greer thanking her for the testimony. She read 14 pages of the book she'd brought from her old life and retained nothing. Rosa came in the afternoon and they made bread together without talking much, which was the most comfortable kind of company Rosa offered, and the kind Eleanor had come to prefer. Whatever happens tomorrow, Rosa said at one point, working her section of dough. Those boys are different than they were in September. I know, Eleanor said. I've been here 7 years, Rosa said. I saw them after their mother died. I saw what that house was like for 8 months. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. Nobody can take that back. What you did, it's in them now. Eleanor kept working her own dough. Her throat did something she declined to give in to. You're not a soft woman, Rosa said. It was not a criticism. I don't say that wrong. I mean, it's good. Those boys didn't need soft. They needed someone who wouldn't break when things got hard and wouldn't leave when it got uncomfortable. She paused. They needed someone who'd still be there Wednesday morning. Eleanor looked at the bread. I almost wasn't, she said. I almost got on that train. But you didn't, Rosa said. I didn't, Eleanor agreed. Rosa gave the dough one final press and covered it to rise. The train would have been easier, she said, and went to wash her hands, and that was the end of the conversation, which was exactly the right length. Colton came in for dinner, and they all ate together. The 4 of them and Walt, which had become a usual enough arrangement that it felt strange to imagine the table any other way. And Owen gave a full account of the ice pond expedition, which had involved one moment of genuine alarm when Eli had walked slightly too far toward the center before Walt had called him back. And Eli's version of events, delivered in his economic way, contradicted Owen's on several key details. And the argument about whose version was accurate carried them through the meal and the clearing of the table and most of the way through bedtime. And Eleanor thought, this exact thing. This is what the courtroom was for. She put the boys to bed. Owen was asleep within 10 minutes, which was how Owen handled stress. He put it down and slept on it and picked it up again in the morning if it was still there. Eli was awake longer. She sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and they didn't talk, just sat. And after a while, Eli said, Eleanor. Yeah. If he says no, yet he's not going to say no, Eleanor said. She didn't know that, but she said it the way you say certain things to children in the dark. Not as a lie exactly, but as a thing you intend to make true by the force of your own will, and which you state out loud because some things need to be said in order to be believed. Eli was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. He was asleep 10 minutes after that. She went back downstairs. Colton was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee cup empty and his hands around it anyway, and he looked up when she came in. She sat across from him. They're asleep, she said. Both of them? Both. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, then, I've been thinking about what happens if the ruling doesn't go our way. Don't, Eleanor said. I have to, he said. I have to think about it because if I haven't thought about it and it happens, I won't be able to function, and I need to be able to function. She understood that. It was how he was built. The man who checked the water lines before noon so they didn't haul from the well all week. The man who planned because planning was the only control available. All right, she said. Think about it. Buyer says a temporary order could be appealed quickly if we have new information. The railroad documentation, he stopped. I keep coming back to the fact that Clarestine's letter might have been the thing that changed it. If Alderman connects the survey timeline to the custody petition timing, the whole foundation of their case comes apart. It should be enough, Eleanor said. Should be, he said. That's the part I can't get past. She looked at him across the table. This man who had been driving himself on insufficient sleep and accumulated guilt for 8 months before a stranger on a platform agreed to come home with him, who had said, I want my boys to laugh again with the simplicity of someone stating the most important thing they knew, who had stood in a courtroom in an uncomfortable suit and accounted for his failures without flinching because the truth was the only instrument he had that he fully trusted. Colton, she said. He looked at her. Whatever Alderman says tomorrow, whatever happens, you are a good father. She said it plainly, without softening it or making it more than it was. I know you don't believe that. I know you've been carrying the October decision like a sentence you're serving. But I've been in this house for 2 months and I have watched you with those boys, and I need you to hear me say it clearly so that you've heard it at least once from someone who has no reason to tell you anything other than what's true. She paused. You're a good father. You've always been a good father. You made a wrong call in October, and you are not the sum of your worst decision. He looked at her for a long time. His face was very still. I don't know what I would have done, he said finally, if you hadn't been on that platform. You'd have found someone else, Eleanor said. No, he said. I wouldn't have. He said it with the certainty of someone who had considered the alternative and understood it. I would have gone back to the ranch and kept going through the motions, and the boys would have kept fading, and I would have told myself they were fine. He looked down at his empty cup. You asked me things nobody else asked. You told Owen things nobody else told him. You sat on Eli's floor in the dark, and you just stayed. Eleanor said nothing. I am not good at this, Colton said. Saying things. Margaret always... He stopped, said her name differently, more carefully. Margaret was the one who said things. I was the one who did them and let her translate. He looked up. I'm trying to say something, and I'm doing it badly. You're doing fine, Eleanor said. I'm saying that this... He gestured between them, at the kitchen, at the house above them where his sons were sleeping. This is not what I planned when I went to that platform. I went there because I was desperate, and someone told me a woman in a desperate situation might agree to a desperate proposal, and I went and I asked, and I didn't think past that. I didn't think about what it would be like to have someone in this house who made it a house again. He looked at her steadily. I didn't plan to need you. Not like this. Eleanor looked back at him. She thought about the bookshop she'd wanted. The one with accounts she was good at, and books she knew, and a cat she hadn't named yet. She thought about the life she'd been building out of limited materials before her father's debts had taken the materials away. She thought about $8.40 and a wrist bruise, and the sound of a train she hadn't boarded pulling away from a platform. She thought about what she'd told Owen. It gets different. You learn to carry it differently. I didn't plan any of this either, she said. I was trying not to drown. I got into a stranger's wagon because drowning seemed like the only other option. She paused. But I've been here 2 months, and I know this ranch better than I knew anything in my old life. And I know your sons better than I knew anyone in my old life. And I know you better than I planned to. She met his eyes. I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go anymore. I want you to know that. I'm here because I want to be. He reached across the table. Not for her hand. He covered it, the same way he had in the wagon driving home from the courthouse, the same steady, unremarkable gesture that was his equivalent of everything he couldn't quite form into sentences. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while. In the kitchen at the end of Wednesday, and the fire ticked in the stove and the house settled around them, and outside the night was cold and clear and indifferent to what Thursday would bring. Thursday came. Buyer's office sent a message by early rider at 8 in the morning. The boy who brought it was maybe 16, serious about the importance of his errand in the way that young people are serious about important errands, and he handed the folded paper to Colton at the front door and waited for a response. Colton read it. Eleanor watched his face. He looked up. His face was doing the lockdown thing, the thing it did when something mattered too much, and for one terrible second she couldn't read which direction it was going. Then something in it gave way. Not broke, just released, the way a held breath releases, and she knew. Petition dismissed, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Full custody confirmed. Alderman's written ruling cites. He stopped. Read again. Cites lack of credible evidence of parental instability and evidence of a financially motivated custody claim inconsistent with the children's welfare. He looked at the paper. He cited Clara's letter. Eleanor sat down on the porch step because her legs made the decision before she did. Colton said something to the young rider, pressed some money into his hand, and the boy went back to his horse satisfied. Colton sat on the step beside Eleanor. They sat there for a minute without saying anything in the cold morning air, and Eleanor pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed, and Colton sat beside her with his elbows on his knees and the paper still in his hand, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't a sentence that fit inside what they were both feeling right then. Then Owen appeared at the door behind them. He'd been listening. Of course he'd been listening. Owen was constitutionally incapable of not listening, and he had already understood enough from the quality of the silence outside to know what he was walking into. Did he say yes? Owen said. Colton turned. Yeah, he said. He said yes. Owen made a sound that was not quite a word and launched himself off the step onto his father with the complete physical commitment of a 4-year-old who has been waiting a long time to do exactly that. Colton caught him and held on and buried his face against his son's shoulder, and Owen's arms went around his father's neck, and they stayed like that in the cold morning with Eleanor on the step beside them. Eli appeared in the doorway. He stood there looking at the scene in front of him with his careful, assessing expression, and then his eyes found Eleanor. She held out her hand. He came to the step and sat beside her, and she put her arm around him, and he leaned into her the way he had in the dark hallway months ago, the way he had that night when he'd cried hard and said okay when it was finished. His face was very still, but his shoulders were not, and she held on. Okay, he said. Into her coat. One word. All the words. Okay, she said back. Walt came around the side of the house sometime later. He'd been at the barn and had apparently seen the rider come and go. And he looked at the scene on the front porch, and looked at Colton, and Colton looked back at him, and Walt nodded once in the precise, economical way of a man who has received important information and confirmed it internally and has nothing further to add. Then he said, I'll fix the north fence line today, and went back to the barn, and Eleanor almost laughed. The news reached town quickly, the way news does in places where everyone knows everyone. Buyer sent a brief letter with the legal particulars. Agnes Purdy sent a postcard that said simply, good. A P. Rosa came that afternoon and made a cake without being asked and presented it without ceremony and said the boys could have it after dinner if they ate properly, which they did, with the focused efficiency of children who understand the conditions of dessert. Gerald Fitch was not heard from directly. Buyer sent a separate note indicating that Fitch had apparently left town sometime after the hearing, destination unspecified. Eleanor read this, set the note down, and went about her day. She did not spend significant time being glad he was gone because he had taken up enough of her mental space already, and she was disinclined to give him more of it. The Voss family was harder. 3 days after the ruling, a letter arrived from Harlan Voss. It was shorter than Eleanor expected and different in tone from every previous interaction with him. He did not apologize. She hadn't expected that. It wasn't in him, and she didn't require it. But he wrote that he and Dorothea wished to remain part of the boys' lives, if that was acceptable, and that they understood a different arrangement than the one they had sought would need to be worked out, and that, this was the line Eleanor read twice, Dorothea had been glad to see the boys were well. She gave the letter to Colton without comment. He read it and folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, which was where he kept things he needed to think about before deciding. A week later, he wrote back. Eleanor didn't read the letter, but she knew from the length of time he spent at the desk writing it that it was not short and not simple. He told her afterward that he had offered the Voss family regular visits twice a year, with conditions around the quality of those visits that he stated plainly, and that Buyer had helped him phrase in terms that were legally clear. Was that the right thing? Eleanor asked. I think so, he said. They lost their daughter. Whatever Harlan was doing, whatever he was using the boys for, Dorothea lost her daughter. He paused. Owen and Eli should know their mother's family. Margaret would have wanted that. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd never met, the one whose death had begun all of this. Thought about the photograph she'd seen once when Colton had shown her the album. A young woman with dark hair and an expression that suggested she found something slightly funny about being photographed. The boys had her mouth. The question asking, the drawing, those had come from somewhere, from the person Margaret had been, and Eleanor would not erase that, could not, would not want to. She went upstairs that evening and found the boys in their room, Owen reading aloud from a book with pictures and Eli listening and correcting him when he got the words wrong, which was frequently. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, I want to show you something. She brought down the photograph album and sat on the floor with both boys and turned to Margaret's photographs, and she showed them to Owen and Eli and told them, Your mama was funny. You can tell from her face. Owen looked at the photograph seriously. Eli reached out and touched the edge of the page very gently. She's still yours, Eleanor said. She'll always be yours. I'm not here to take her place. I couldn't, and I wouldn't try. I'm here because your dad needed help, and you needed somebody, and I needed a place to belong, and it turned out this was it. She paused. You can love her and still have room for everything else. That's how it works. Owen looked at the photograph for a long time. Her hair's like Eli's, he said finally. It is, Eleanor agreed. Eli was quiet for a while. Then, she would have liked you, he said. Just that. Delivered as fact, the way Eli delivered everything, with the precision of a child who did not say things he didn't mean. Eleanor kept her voice even. I hope so, she said. She put the album on the boys' bookshelf where they could reach it. Spring came to Mercer Ranch the way spring comes after hard winters. Tentatively at first, in muddy patches and false starts, and then all at once with a thoroughness that made the winter seem like something that had happened somewhere else. The frozen pond where Eli had gone too far toward the center became first slush and then open water. The north fence Walt had repaired held through the thaw. The horses spent their first afternoon turned out in the pasture with the particular energized confusion of animals who had been indoors too long and were not quite sure what to do with all the space. Owen found a bird's nest in the oak tree by the barn and monitored it with the dedication of a naturalist, reporting on its contents daily. Eli began drawing the nest's occupants, first the eggs, then the hatchlings, and the series of drawings made their way to the kitchen wall beside the original horse drawing, which was still there, slightly faded, pinned exactly where Eleanor had put it months ago. Eleanor started a kitchen garden. She had no particular expertise in this, and the first 2 weeks of it were humbling,
But Rosa gave her useful information in the brief, decisive sentences that were Rosa's native language. And by April, there were things growing in the plot beside the house that had not been growing there before. And Eleanor found that she minded the imperfection of the results less than she'd expected. She and Colton figured out how to be married in the specific daily way that marriage actually requires, which was harder and less romantic and more sustaining than anything she'd imagined about it as a younger woman. They disagreed about money once, significantly, about a decision he'd made regarding a contract without discussing it with her first, and the argument that followed was not comfortable and was not brief and ended without full resolution for about 3 days until Colton came into the kitchen one morning and said, "You were right. I should have talked to you first." And Eleanor said, "Yes, you should have." And that was the end of it. They were both better for having had it, which was also more than she'd expected. He learned to say the things in his head more often, which he was not naturally built for, and which cost him effort she could see. She learned to ask for what she needed directly, instead of waiting to see if he noticed, which was something she had never been good at and which she was still not good at, but was improving. The boys watched the two of them the way children watch the adults who are their foundation, constantly, registering everything, building their internal model of what adults in relation to each other looked like. Eleanor was aware of this, and it made her honest. Not perfect. Honest. Agnes Purdy sent word in May that the county school was expanding and would need volunteers to help with the new readers program, adults who could sit with children after school and work through books with them. Eleanor wrote back that she'd come on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she did, and she was good at it, and being good at it reminded her of what she'd told Colton about the bookshop. She told him again one evening in the parlor, the fire going, boys in bed. "I still want it," she said. "Someday. Not here. The ranch needs the space, but somewhere in town maybe, when the boys are old enough to need less. A small thing. Books and accounts and—" "A cat," Colton said. "A cat," she confirmed. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of warmth, which was not demonstrative but was real. The specific quality of attention he gave things he cared about. "I'll build you the shelves," he said. She looked back at him. She believed him. There was a Sunday in June, a Sunday that did not announce itself as significant in any way, when Eleanor was sitting on the porch in the afternoon with a cup of tea going cold beside her and the warm air coming across the pasture, and Eli came out and sat beside her without saying anything. And Owen was somewhere near the barn engaged in the latest chapter of his ongoing project to convince Walt to let him name all the horses. And Colton was at the fence line but in the visible distance, and the ranch lay around all of them in the green specific warmth of early summer. Eli leaned against Eleanor's arm. He looked out at the pasture. "Eleanor," he said. "Yeah." "Is this what it's supposed to be like?" She didn't ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. "I think so," she said. "Yeah. I think this is what it's supposed to be like." He nodded. He stayed where he was. She thought about train platforms and $8.40 and a mark on a wrist that had faded entirely. She thought about what she'd told herself on that first night in the small cold room. Take each day, no promises, no risks with the heart she couldn't afford. She thought about how wrong that had turned out to be. Not in the way she'd feared, but in the best possible way. She had taken the risk, had made herself available to loss, and the loss hadn't come. And what had come instead was this. A porch in June, a boy leaning on her arm, a man visible in the distance coming in from the fence line. She had not gotten here by being safe. She had gotten here by being willing to step off a platform into uncertainty, willing to stay when staying was hard, willing to tell the truth when lying would have been easier, willing to be known by people who might not like what they found. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood at 27, standing on a train platform with nowhere to go. Safety isn't a place you find. It's a thing you build out of showing up day after day for the people you've decided to belong to. It doesn't arrive complete. It gets made. Slowly, imperfectly, with arguments and cold mornings and biscuits that catch on one side, and bread that doesn't always rise right, and children who wake in the night, and a man who forgets to eat, and a woman who forgets to ask for what she needs. It gets made by people who stay. Colton came in from the pasture and came to the porch and looked at Eleanor and Eli and didn't say anything,
just came up the steps and sat in the other chair, and the three of them sat in the June afternoon together, which was ordinary and unremarkable and exactly enough. Owen appeared from the direction of the barn at a run, the run of a child who has just thought of something important and is transporting it at maximum speed to the person who needs to know it. Walt said, Owen announced, arriving at the porch steps breathless, that if I want to name the horses, I have to be able to tell which one is which from 100 feet. He planted his hands on his knees to catch his breath. Which I can. I can tell them all apart. Can you? Colton said. Yes, and I already have names. He held up his fingers to count. Bucket stays Bucket because he already knows his name. The gray one is Senator because he looks like he's thinking about important things. The two bays are going to be, come inside, Eleanor said. Tell us at dinner. Sit down and take off your boots first. Owen looked briefly like he might argue the order of operations. Then he looked at his father, who had the expression of a man who was not going to weigh in on this particular question, and then at Eli, who was no help at all. And then he came up the porch steps and went inside, still talking about the bay horses. Eli stood up and followed his brother inside. Colton looked at Eleanor. She looked back. Outside, the light was doing the thing it did in June evenings, coming in sideways, warm and golden and longer than you expected, staying past when you thought it would go. The pasture was green. The ranch was quiet in the specific way of a place that is inhabited and cared for. The oak tree by the barn had leaves now, full summer leaves, and somewhere in them a bird was making the sound birds make when they are exactly where they're supposed to be. Eleanor picked up her cold tea and stood up and went inside to make dinner. She had a family to feed.